the big thing is we believe a disease is caused just by a germ, and that's all we have to worry about. So we have to protect ourselves from the out there.
Mm-hmm.
And only a small group of humans have concluded this, right? They basically have a self-reinforcing kind of ideology. And anybody who challenges it might be from the outside, but they don't care about that because they already know that this is true. But because every disease declined before there are medical interventions to stop that germ, this can't be an exact correct equation. It can't be true. This is a false idea. There has to be more to it than just a particular germ, a particular microbe. And that's what we're going to, kind of address here.
Yeah.
But Suzanne, who's a brilliant woman, and she's an honest person. She gave up her career because she saw how things were being done wrong in the hospitals, and they were just automatically injecting everybody with the flu vaccine at the time. And with enough indoctrination and repetition, mythology becomes a collective reality, but that doesn't make it true. Again, we're stuck with this idea of the out there, and this out there must be stopped. It must be stopped, otherwise we're doomed, right? So we use vaccines, and if that doesn't work, we use antibiotics because we have to stop the thing. But again, as we saw in all the data, that's can't be the case because these interventions came in well after and they had little effect. So we have this perception that, and I used to have this perception, that back in the 1800s, people had top hats and women had parasols and they rode around in nice carriages and nice, clean environment off to the country for a picnic, and everything was lovely. But that's not a real reality. The good old days were not the good old days for many, many people. If you were quite wealthy, it was pretty good. But life really was a struggle. It was a struggle for many people, especially in the cities. So we're going to cover all the different factors that made life really miserable for lots of people. But, you had a struggle of sickness and death, high mortality rate, especially in the young. So we had hazardous housing. And so because these cities basically sprung up really fast, these buildings were just awful. They were filled with garbage. They didn't know what to do with all the garbage. They were all crammed into these very crowded areas. And you had an environment where people were all crowded together, jammed up. There was no place to put their refuse. And, it was just an awful situation. They would even at times bury their dead into the walls, called intramural burials. So everything was all jammed up. The manufacturing of tanneries and slaughterhouses were all put into where people lived.
Yeah.
And this particular quote's from an 1861 article. The sewage, there's no toilets. Here we see one from 1916, but before that, there's no toilets. There's outhouses. And basically all your waste and all the animal waste and all the industrial waste went into the water supply. It went out the window, and it would rain. It would get drained into the Thames River or whatever your water supply was. And so your only source of drinking is from that water supply. So you're drinking from a industrial toilet. So without having these infrastructure put in place, you're going to be drinking that.
So that's okay. You can vaccinate against that, can't you?
Yeah. So you had horrible living conditions. So
yeah.
And I alluded to this already. You have horses. That was your main form of transportation. They would be stomping around, and they often died after 2 or 3 years because they were ill too. And then they just pooped in the streets. And so sometimes you had, deep trenches of poop all over the place, and you would get that on your shoes, and you would drag it into your house. And so this is, a picture from 1893, but yeah, the streets were filled with, horse manure. And of course, then you have all the flies. People didn't often have screens, so all this stuff was all over the place. You also had horrible pollution because the only thing you had to heat with is coal, and factories were done with coal. So you're burning all that stuff, and all the carbonic acid and all the fumes go up, and depending on weather conditions will settle back down. And so you were not only living in a giant, drinking from a giant industrial toilet, and you were also living in a chimney. So your lung function couldn't have been good, right?
Yeah.
And they, various people noticed that, when things got, they would call it foggy, but it was not the fog. It was all the industrial smoke coming down on you. So they would call that was the London fog. The London fog wasn't like, nice water vapor. It was mixed with all this stuff.
It's quite interesting because if you look at an old film of the Houses of Parliament in London, they were black. But around, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, they were sandblasted clean. And the Houses of Parliament, as people, if they look at it now, it's like a sandy color. But I grew up thinking the Houses of Parliament were black.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Right. And obviously it was from all the coal burning that was taking place at the time.
All the smog on the coal and all that stuff really didn't cleaned up till later in the early mid 1900s. They still had people dying from smoke pollution. Food was not good. Sometimes people were starving. Food was often contaminated and with who knows what, because the animals were sick, the people were sick, and the stuff that you would buy could be rotting because there's no refrigeration. So anything you got was probably not fresh, or the fruit wasn't really ripe. It was just picked off a tree. It's just a big mess of horrible food. And so you could die just directly from contaminated food. And people were at different points in time were actually starving to death. They didn't have enough food, and so you would be just, if you're not having food, you're not going to be healthy for sure, right?
Yeah, a lot more susceptible to illness.
Sure. Massive overcrowding in the cities. And you would find just masses of people in a building, and some people lived in the cellars where all the your toilet stuff went in. Living with the vermin too. I mean, just dreadful conditions. And then when you died, somebody died in your family, what were you going to do with the corpse? You left it there, or you buried it in the wall because you had to figure out what to do with it. So imagine being in a room like maybe this size with 17 people and someone's dead in the corner. So work was horrible for a lot of people. People worked for 12, 14, 16, 18 hours a day at the most horrible, menial, dreary work. Day after day, no vacation, no time off. They just worked every day just to survive. Women often turned to prostitution to try to make ends meet. So it was not good. There was a book from somewhere in the 1850s, and it talked about part of London. What's the name of the place? I forgot the name of the place. Benthall Falls. Is that right? Benthall Falls, I think.
Never heard of it.
It's a section in London, East London. I can't.
Oh, Bethnal Green.
Bethnal Green. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they wrote about that there was hundreds of thousands of miserable poor on the ragged edge of misery. So there were sections of London that were good on the West End apparently, but the East End was just jammed up with the poor, miserable poor. that were starving and working hard and, dying early.
Yeah, it was also the east of London that was bombed during the Second World War as well, not the west.
Interesting. Child labor. So it wasn't just adults working. Children as young as 4 were working in mines and factories. They used them for, going in machines and going in little tunnels in the coal mines. And this was written about in 1890. Labor for 12 to 13, up in 16 hours a day was the rule. It wasn't like an exception, like, oh, we got to get this done today. So they didn't have any enjoyment, no exercise, no fresh air, no exposure to sunlight, no good food. How are you going to end up, growing up to be at all? So, and if you were sick, who's going to take care of you? No, you just, essentially just crawled over to the side and died. So as they talked about here, a 7-year-old girl worked sitting in the hot sun while she was sick with measles, and then she died. So no one gave her, limeade or made sure she had some good water and rest in a bed. And that didn't happen. She just worked, and died. And there was also really crazy medical ideas of bleeding people for almost every condition. And that went on for centuries. Oh, you have a fever. I'm going to bleed you. I'm going to, if not, I'll bleed you, and I'm going to give you some calomel, which is mercury, or some other toxic medication. And this is a particular picture where somebody was given the mercury and his tongue swelled up to enormous proportions. So all these kinds of types of really crazy medical ideas. Another one was called the hot regimen, where if you were sick from something, they would put you in a hot room, no fresh air, no fresh water, and they would give you a little mercury. And of course, that didn't end well for everybody, right?
Yeah.
So they increased the death rate by trying to treat these diseases, where if various doctors noticed over the century or over the decades that if you just left them alone, they would have been much better off. They would have been fine. But instead, the treatments themselves were causing the problem.
Yeah.
And they actually bled George Washington, the first president of the United States. They bled him to death because he had a cold or the flu. So they repeatedly bled him to the point where he would just die. And they also gave him, I believe, mercury and they gave you that to clean out your digestive system. And they also did blister packs and some other stuff. But basically, they bled him to death, bled and poisoned him to death.
Thanks for watching this video on our YouTube channel. If you want to listen to the full episode, you can do by subscribing to the Radical Health Rebel podcast using the QR code on the screen. Or if you, like me, you prefer to watch the full episode, you can subscribe to our Substack using the QR code on the screen right now.